There's a gesture in every single Mass, because everything that we do in the Mass has deep symbolic meaning and significance. Everything that we do in the ancient Catholic liturgy is not by accident. So we process in, and what does the priest immediately do once he gets to the altar? Do you notice that? I do it, and Deacon Rob and I do it. And if you go to the Latin Mass at 2 p.m. that we do here as well, we do the same gesture. We kiss the altar. Ever wondered why? Why do we do that? We kiss the altar in the beginning of Mass and at the end. We kiss the altar. Look at it now, again, from the perspective of a first century Jew, because if a Jewish person were to see an altar, immediately they would think the altar is the place of sacrifice, death. Why are we kissing an instrument of death? Pause there. We'll come back to it at the end. Probably one of the most famous authors of the last century was a Jewish man by the name of Viktor Frankl. He wrote A Man's Search for Meaning. He survived one of the darkest periods of human history, the Nazi concentration camps. In one pivotal moment when he describes when the Nazis were marching the Jews through the snow, he was about to give up. And he said in that moment when he was about to just give up his life because he had ran out of strength, an image of his wife came to mind. And he described it was like a blazing radiance. And it gave him that strength to endure. He would famously say that if you wish to give off light, you must endure burning. If you wish to radiate light, he says, you must endure burning. When you think about it, isn't that so true? It's the laws of thermodynamics. Anything that gives off light must consume and sacrifice itself. For example, you look at the candles here on the altar. So we're required by liturgical law to have candles at every single Mass. Do you know how much we pay each year for candles, by the way? I know it now because we're working on our budget currently for the upcoming fiscal year, so I know the number comes to mind immediately. Every year, we budget nearly $5,000 just for candles. To burn candles. Why? Because in order to radiate this light, the candles consume itself. Or how about the sun? Many of you are sitting in the sun, especially on this side of the church. Our sun, in order to radiate this light right now, is dying. It's literally in order to enjoy the light that we receive, which our lives are dependent upon. The sun is literally consuming itself. And in 5 billion years, when the hydrogen finally runs out, the sun will begin to enter its dying phase. It will turn into a red giant, which at this point, the earth will be destroyed because the sun will expand its diameter. And then from the red giant, it will turn into a planetary nebula, this huge gaseous sphere. And then its final gasp will be the stage of the White Dwarf, where they will cool into oblivion. The sun, it's hard to fathom, but it is literally dying to radiate light. Something similar happens to the soul. Our Lord today in the gospel says something very beautifully. He says, I have come to set the world on fire, and how I wish it were already blazing. What's he talking about? I have come to set the world on fire, and how I wish it were already blazing. What's he talking about? He's talking about light, isn't he? A flame, fire. In John chapter 8, Jesus beautifully said, I am the light of the world. Light. And if you wish to radiate light, we must consume ourselves. Why is the Christian life so hard? It is because, again, as fellow sinners, we do not wish to endure burning. The most famous exorcist in the United States is a priest in San Jose, Father Gary Thomas. Hollywood, a few years ago, many of you may have seen it, they made a movie about Father Gary called The Rite. I mean, it was doctored up, it was fancy, as Hollywood does, especially when it talks about Catholic themes. But the heart of the story was about the ministry of Father Gary. And I kid you not, every single week, Father Gary's parish receives hundreds of calls from all over the world, from people experiencing demonic oppression and possession, and they need the help of a Catholic priest. And they're desperate because they've exhausted every medical means, and they turn to the church, believers and non-believers. And there's a joke saying that everybody makes fun of Catholics until you need an exorcist. Father Gary said that people fall into Satanism, sadly, because they think they can get from the devil what God has said no to. You can hear that again. People fall into Satanism, to the occult, into the dark powers, because they think they can get from the devil something that God has already said no to. You see, this is where the Lord speaks about idolatry. Oftentimes, the Israelites, in the Old Testament, they always would fall into idolatry. Like, what is idolatry? Well, essentially, it is the lifting up of something in place of where God should be. You see, every single human being is wired to worship. Every single human culture worships something. This idea that people are atheists or don't worship anything, that's rather a new idea in human history. Because if we don't worship God, we'll worship something else. And oftentimes, if it's not God, it's often myself, or the God that I create in my own image and likeness. And so all throughout the Old Testament, when the Israelites would fall into idolatry, if you remember that pivotal moment in Exodus chapter 34, when Moses was on Mount Sinai, and he took too long, do you remember what the Israelites did? They fashioned that golden calf. Why was that? Well, because they fashioned that golden calf because they wanted to exert their will upon God. That they thought if they could create him, they could manipulate him and then get whatever they wanted. See, that's where we all fall into trouble. Whenever we assert our will above everything else. That's why it's so hard to walk the Christian life, because, let's admit it, sometimes God takes too long. He's too slow. And sometimes he says no to my desires, and we get angry and frustrated because, again, as fellow sinners, what do we always want? Well, we want our will to be dominant. But our Lord shows us the way. Paul, writing the second letter, Paul says, He endured the cross, despising its shame. In John chapter 12, Jesus shares a beautiful analogy. He says, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains but just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. Now let's return to that gesture of the priest and deacon kissing the altar, this instrument of death. The altar in our theology as Catholics represents Jesus Christ, who is the priest and the victim of sacrifice all in one. We kiss the altar as a reminder. It is only when I die for the good of my beloved, when life finally happens. You see, it is when we put the desires of our family, the parish, God first, and I die to myself and I endure this burning, that the world will be set ablaze. It is countercultural and paradoxical. That is why Jesus sacrificed himself, so he can set the world on fire.